Hello everybody, it's Mr. McKeever. Today we're going to talk about economics. So if you guys remember the last time we talked about economics in this class, we were introducing the ideas of a guy named Adam Smith. And Adam Smith had some pretty monumental concepts of how people make decisions and how to deal with their money. And particularly, he had three set laws, these three natural laws of economics, where that one, people work for their own self-interest. Everything we do for some benefit that we receive. That competition not only drives down prices, but it inspires innovation. And that we have a law of supply and demand where we really only value things that other people don't have. So these are kind of the basics of how he viewed economics being played out. And because of this, he believed that if we stayed out of it, if we practiced what he called a laissez-faire mentality, stayed out of the economics of a country, the invisible hand would just kind of guide things to what would be best for society. Well, these are just the foundation of modern economics, folks. We're going to continue to build upon these ideas, and one of the first great economists after Adam Smith is a guy named Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus is a huge advocate of Adam Smith's ideas. The ideas that there is and always should be free market capitalism, that we should take a laissez-faire approach. But he also realizes that there are situations that will eventually need to be addressed in society. Some of these situations are just reality. Some of them are based off of our mentalities and how we act and how we behave. So let's play through some of these. First and most important, he argued that population growth in the world that he was living in, which is the 1800s and now the early ages of the Industrial Revolution, is outpacing food supply. And that eventually there will be way too many people on this planet for everyone to have what they need to live. The population is just growing way too quickly. And this was a problem. Unless we do something about this, we start regulating the family size of people, man's misery will eventually become a global epidemic and will consume our civilization as a whole. So this is a problem that needs to be addressed, and he's not inherently wrong. Even Adam Smith early on realized that there were probably some scenarios where this could play out. One of his favorite quotes is, "No society can surely be flourishing and happy, of which by far the greater part of the numbers are poor and miserable." Smith realized early on that if all of society hates their life, then the society cannot progress, it cannot sustain itself. Well, Malthus is realizing that this is coming probably faster than Smith ever anticipated because of population growth. So that is going to be something that needs to be addressed, otherwise we'll just start eating each other. Well, other economists are going to continue to weigh into things. A guy by, Capitalism Breeds Inequality Poverty. A guy by the name of David Ricardo is going to further nitpick and kind of realize some more of the harsh realities of capitalism. He states that in order for us to be motivated to actually get up and go to work every day, there needs to be some motivator to do that. And he described that motivator as a permanent underclass of poor people. It is our seeing and experiencing the lives of these poor people that remind us to get up and go to work on a Monday morning, and that if we don't, we will end up like these people. Now, he has some base ideas, and this would probably be around 5% of the population was all you would need, and that is kind of just the staple of reality. Well, this is going to bother some people later on because the notion of just saying, hey, 5% of the population of the world is just always going to be perpetually in poverty and unhappy kind of tugs at the heartstrings of a lot of people. Well, some of his other ideas are a little bit less controversial and a little bit more straightforward. He's going to introduce a couple concepts that modern economists use all the time today. Things like opportunity cost and comparative advantage. Basically, an opportunity cost is something where if you decide to do anything, your decision to do something leads to you not doing something else. So your opportunity cost of going to school is that you don't get to sleep in until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Okay, so every decision has a cost that goes along with it, and this applies to nations as well. This is where comparative advantage plays out. Societies produce things better than other ones. Some societies are great at making technology, some are great at making coal, whatever it is important for a society or for a nation to realize what they are best at and realize that they are best off doing what they're good at and using that to obtain what they're bad at than trying to do everything at once. This is significant because it's going to start opening up the ideas that we need kind of a global economic system. Some countries, some nations are just going to be very good at doing one or two things really well, and that it is in their best interest to use that thing that they are good at to get what else they need through trade, which means that societies have to be open to consistent trade with each other to promote this sort of specialization that nations need to do in order to be productive. His last major contribution is known as the Iron Law of Wages. The reality is that there are so many workers that are out there. And because there is competition for jobs, there aren't nearly as many jobs as there are workers. This is going to drive down prices and levels of wages for employees, because one worker will undercut another worker in order to get whatever jobs are actually available during this time period. Well, eventually this is a problem. At first it's great for the businesses to keep wages kind of in control, but eventually it's going to lead to rampant unemployment and poverty, because eventually wages will drive themselves so low that people can't live off of them. And that's a problem, because at that point in time, society will just give up and decide, hey, laziness works. If I'm not going to make enough money to support myself by working, there's no reason to work. And that is an eventual point where society fails. So why are we talking about all this stuff? Well, this is going to start to invoke desires for different systems. Nations around the world are going to start struggling with inequality at a pretty massive scale. Countries themselves are making tons of money, but that money is being focused exclusively in the extremely wealthy. People are becoming wealthier than anyone had ever imagined during this period, but the vast majority of the population is living really unfortunate lives. They can't seem to catch a break because of competition for jobs, and people thought that we were getting really close to that point where society will just revolt against what's going on. And that was scary for a lot of folks. So let's readdress how to deal with this. And people start coming up with new ideas as to how to approach a society that will prevent this eventual overthrow of what's going on, because people are that upset. Well, what does this look like? Well, we call it socialism today, but it's not what people generally characterize as socialism. And there was no original mindset as to exactly how this works. There's an evolution of thought here that we're going to walk through. The first person who supposedly creates these kind of socialist ideas would actually kind of shock you in the eyes of many socialists, and that is actually God itself. People believe that originally in the Bible you see the mindset of a socialist economy and a socialist way of life in living and looking through the eyes of how Jesus lived. Why is that significant? Well, the reality is people have a hard time stomaching true capitalism. That notion that we must allow certain people to be poor, that wages are going to be driven by competition, is a little unsettling for a lot of people. Especially people who came from strong Christian backgrounds. And with Christianity on the rise during this period, during the Romantic Age, that's going to have a pretty significant influence on how people think. So we see people like Jeremy Bentham, who kind of comes up with a concept called utilitarianism. Some people call it utilitarian socialism. But the idea is that a government needs to intervene in economics to promote the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And that items and taxes and laws and anything a government does should be judged as to whether or not they are useful to society. Everything should be about the greater good of the civilization itself. And this is very different from the hardline ideas of Adam Smith and Thomas Malthus. He's advocating for government becoming incredibly involved in the economics of an area. And he's not alone. People like Claude-Henri de Saint-Simon is also going to look at the notion of a group of people starting to make decisions for society. He has a little bit of a different spin, though. He doesn't talk about an individual government doing it. He looks at a group of oligarchical business people, people who are best versed in economics. And that oligarchy will then decide for the people what the best decisions are. Well, this is not a concept that is going to be adopted by a lot of people in Europe. People don't like trusting the fate of civilization to a bunch of really rich people. So this is going to be pretty marginalized. But what's actually kind of significant about this is that we will see communities formed around these ideas of Saint Simonianism. I cannot pronounce that correctly. But they aren't important because they adopt that. They are actually important because they become the breeding grounds of the modern feminist movement. People who are willing to adopt these ideas tend to be a little bit more inclined to reassociating or reimagining all aspects of life. And part of that is the role of women in society. So these small communities will actually start to really encourage women to become more active participants in the workplace. Well, what else is going on? Well, we also start to see people like John Stuart Mill, who looks at capitalism as this rampant plague on society. All it does is it breeds inequality, impoverishment, and that is not acceptable for a Western civilization. So he starts looking at ideas that are supposed to help ordinary people. In his mind, there is an opportunity or potential for humans to develop a utopia. And people start to toy around with this idea, the idea of creating the perfect community, one that everyone has a place, everyone has a role, that all society is welcome in. And actually, we'll see this implemented by people like Robert Owen, who will create his utopian society in New Harmony, Indiana. Unfortunately, it doesn't live long. We don't have a utopia on this planet. There is no perfect society. If it did happen, our cities would look like this, and we'd have flying cars and great stuff like that. Unfortunately, it fails. And it fails because it doesn't take into account human indiscretions and human mistakes. We screw up sometimes, and because of that, our society is kind of plagued with inequality. Well, we need some more lasting impacts on things, and we're actually going to see quite a few of these. Charles Fourier is going to come up with a concept that's going to be pretty modern in comparison to the ideas of utopianism and even some of the utilitarian socialist ideas. He is known as the first modern socialist, and what he described was the public ownership of the factors of production. And that means that the people of a nation own together the factors of production, which are the land itself, the capital, and how this applies would be like banks. Banking systems would be controlled by the people, by a central government. Labor would be controlled. In regard to that, we're talking like they would set strict labor laws. You work X amount of days. You work X amount of hours. You have a day off. You have lunch periods. You would control what goes on there. And also, it would have influence over intellectual property and inventions. You wouldn't have individuals who are owning railroads or the industry of steam engines. Those basic things should be shared by everyone. So this is going to be a little crazy at the time, but it's a lot more moderate than the notion of creating a utopian society out there. And it's based off of what they viewed as kind of a more optimistic view of humanity. Humans are willing to help other people out if given the chance. We have tons of evidence of this. And we also believe that we will try to progress ourselves to help as many people as possible. Not just looking for our own self-interest, but looking in the interests of other people. So practically, this looks like a government control over things that are needed to survive. Things that are needed by all people, whether it's railroads, base factories, land resources, things like that. The basic necessities needed to live would be provided, and everything else is still up for you to do and create your own life, but the base needs are there. Alright, so let's take this to the next level. We're going to see quite a bit of responses to the capitalist world that takes place in the 1800s. One of those movements is going to really just call for the abolition of everything, and that is the anarchist movement. The anarchist movement is born in the 1800s for a society without capitalism. And that's its true goal in the beginning, because capitalism itself preyed on the weak, according to anarchists. So, we will see a society of people, a group of people that call for the abolition of capitalism and its complicit partner, which is central government. And there's two approaches that are taken to this. We see violent attempts to overthrow the society as a whole by people like Auguste Blanqui, who look for a revolution of the people against the capitalists. And we also see a different approach, one that's much more non-violent and personal. People like Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who just believes in separating themselves from society. Create a small community of people and remove yourself from the capitalist influence and the government influence. Allow them to live on their own away from other people. And this is actually pretty much the model that people in the 1960s and the hippies did. Create a commune, live on there by yourselves, and stay away from everyone else. Alright, well, what if that isn't the option that works for you? Well, there's also a radical form of socialism that comes out of this period, and that is what will be practiced by people like Lenin and Marx and Mao. Karl Marx is going to be a monumental game changer in Europe during the 1800s. He, along with his partner Frederick Engels, are going to publish a book called The Communist Manifesto, one of many books published by Marx during this period, where he looks at the world as it is right now, as capitalism is dominating society, and realizes, hey, this isn't sustainable. Capitalism causes too much unrest, and eventually these workers aren't going to take this anymore. They are going to rise up and overthrow what is going on. And when they do so, they are going to share the wealth amongst all the people, because they're not going to be okay with only a small few benefiting from the work of millions. So what does this mean? Well, he has a pretty long drawn out plan, but it's really vague too. So how does this work? Well, he originally believes that the bourgeoisie, which are the upper class, are going to accumulate the vast majority of wealth in the country. Then the working class, the proletariat, is going to struggle for years without being able to do anything against that. And eventually they're going to give up. They're going to realize that they're never going to win against their bourgeoisie masters, and decides, hey, guess what? We're just going to overthrow you, and a violent revolution will take place. This violent revolution will then take all the wealth from the elites and then redistribute that amongst the people themselves, allowing them to have the basic needs that they need to survive. After that, society will go through a changing period, a shift, where we will no longer prescribe and adhere to the notions of self-interest, where we're only looking for our own personal gain, but also look towards the ideas of benefiting for all. And this will happen from country to country around the world. Once people realize how great it was in one country, the next will adopt it. And eventually this will lead to a society where everyone believes in these Marxist ideals. When that takes place, there's no longer a need for nations. There's no longer a need for large institutions, and those will be abolished, and what everyone will live in are small, localized communities where everyone is democratic, everyone has one vote, and life is perfect. It is the Marxist utopia. So share the wealth, folks.